I never thought my toughest fight after leaving the SEAL teams would be in my own front yard, with a wannabe mall cop pointing a gun at me because his magic HOA key couldn't grant him godlike access to my home. Stick around, folks, because this story gets wild. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. You won't believe the length some people will go to for a tiny slice of imaginary power. It all started innocently enough, or as innocently as things can start when you're dealing with a homeowners association that seems to have more rules than the Geneva Convention. After 2 decades of a life that was anything but quiet, I was looking for exactly that, quiet. A nice house in a calm, manicured neighborhood, a place where the loudest thing I'd hear was the chirping of crickets, not, well, you know. This little enclave, Willow Creek Estates, seemed perfect on paper. Good schools nearby, if I ever decided to foster or adopt, decent-sized lots, and an HOA that, according to the glossy brochure, was dedicated to maintaining property values and community harmony. I should have known community harmony was code for one person's tyrannical vision. My name is Mark, and while my neighbors knew me as the quiet guy who kept to himself and had an almost unnervingly disciplined lawn care schedule, they didn't know about the years spent in places where discipline meant the difference between coming home and not. They didn't need to. That part of my life was filed away, a set of skills I hoped to only use for opening stubborn pickle jars. The fly in the ointment, the grit in the otherwise smooth suburban machinery, was a man named Arthur Henderson. Henderson was, for lack of a better term, the HOA's self-styled security chief, a title he wore with the same ill-fitting solemnity as his too tight, vaguely paramilitary uniform. He patrolled our peaceful streets in an absurdly tricked-out golf cart, complete with flashing amber lights and more unnecessary chrome than a 70s disco ball. He was probably in his late 50s, with a paunch that strained against his duty belt, from which hung various non-lethal but official-looking accoutrements, none of which, I suspected, he was actually certified to use. His face was perpetually set in an expression of officious disapproval, like he'd just smelled something bad and was fairly certain you were responsible. My first run-in was classic HOA pettiness, a polite but firm notice taped to my door regarding the precise angle at which my recycling bin was placed relative to the curb. Apparently, 93 degrees was unacceptable. 90 degrees was the gold standard. I corrected it, offered a polite nod when I next saw Henderson on his patrol, and figured that was that. But it was just the appetizer. Henderson seemed to take my calm compliance not as neighborly cooperation, but as an invitation to escalate. He started with drive-by inspections of my property that felt less like ensuring adherence to bylaws and more like he was casing the joint. I'd be in my home office, which faced the street, and see his golf cart pause, Henderson squinting at my house, sometimes even using a small pair of binoculars. It was unsettling. My training, the instincts honed over years, pinged softly. This wasn't normal scrutiny, this was targeted misses. Henderson, his wife, a woman who looked permanently apologetic and seemed to trail in his wake like a dinghy tied to a much larger, unstable ship, would sometimes be with him. She'd offer these nervous little smiles if she caught anyone's eye, as if to say, "I know, I'm sorry, he's just Arthur." Then came the whispers. During a casual chat with my next-door neighbor, Dave, a friendly retired engineer, the topic of Henderson inevitably came up. "Watch out for that one," Dave had said, lowering his voice conspiratorially as Henderson's golf cart whirred by at the end of the street. "Thinks he's the king of Willow Creek. Heard him bragging at the last HOA meeting, which I only attend for the free stale cookies, that he's got a master key system for emergencies. Says he can get into any house if he needs to." My internal alarms went from a soft ping to a distinct siren. A master key in the hands of that guy? A man whose primary qualification seemed to be an unshakable belief in his own importance? That wasn't just an overreach, it was a disaster waiting to happen. My house wasn't just a collection of wood and drywall, it was my sanctuary, my private space. The idea of Henderson, or anyone unauthorized, having unimpeded access was utterly unacceptable. I started making some quiet upgrades. The locks on my doors were already good, but I upgraded them to high-security Medico cylinders, virtually pick-proof and drill-resistant. I installed a discreet but comprehensive camera system, covering all approaches to my house, cloud storage for the footage, motion alerts to my phone. Nothing overtly aggressive, just sensible precautions. In my old life, we called it hardening a target. It felt a bit ridiculous doing it in sleepy suburbia, but Henderson's smug pronouncements about his master key had lit a fire under me. I also started pulling the HOA documents, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the bylaws, all the thrilling bedtime reading they provide when you buy into one of these places. I read every line, looking for any clause that might grant such sweeping access. Unsurprisingly, there was nothing. Vague language about emergency access for utility companies, yes. Board approval for structural inspections, yes. But nothing about a self-appointed security chief having a passkey to every home like he was some kind of suburban Gandalf. The man was operating on pure, unadulterated ego, and I had a feeling that ego was about to crash headlong into a very solid, unyielding reality. The calm I'd sought was being steadily eroded by this one individual's power trip, and my patience, while considerable, was not infinite. My quiet investigation into Mr. Arthur Henderson and the Willow Creek HOA bylaws quickly became a fascinating, if somewhat depressing, study in petty tyranny and communal apathy. Using skills that felt like overkill for suburban detective work cross-referencing public records, meticulously documenting observations, even a little light social engineering with a chatty former board member I ran into at the hardware store, I pieced together a clearer picture. Henderson, it turned out, wasn't an employee in any meaningful sense. He was a volunteer, the head of the Neighborhood Watch and Safety Committee, a grandiose title largely of his own invention, rubber-stamped by an HOA board that seemed content to let him play sheriff as long as he didn't bother them too much. His authority was entirely self-proclaimed, puffed up by his own hot air and enabled by the board's disinterest or, in some cases, outright intimidation. One elderly resident I spoke to, Mrs. Gable from down the street, told me Henderson had once threatened to have her small dog impounded because it barked at his golf cart, citing a non-existent noise ordinance. She'd been terrified into silence. The man was a bully, plain and simple, draped in the flimsy legitimacy of an HOA polo shirt. The master key rumor was harder to pin down. Some residents scoffed, others looked nervous, and admitted Henderson had implied he had special access for emergencies. I suspected it was more bluster than reality, a way to make himself seem indispensable and powerful. But the claim itself was a serious problem. It created an atmosphere of unease, a feeling that privacy was conditional. I made sure my enhanced security measures were fully operational, testing the camera angles and motion sensors. I felt a grim sort of satisfaction knowing that if Henderson ever did try something foolish, it would be thoroughly documented. My documentation on Henderson himself grew steadily. I had a small notebook where I logged his patrol times, the duration he spent loitering near specific houses, mine included, and any direct interactions. I took discreet photos with my phone, Henderson peering over someone's fence, Henderson shining a flashlight into a parked car late at night, Henderson meticulously measuring the height of someone's decorative garden gnome with a tape measure, his brow furrowed in concentration as if it were a matter of national security. The man was a walking caricature of officious overreach. The inevitable minor confrontation occurred one Saturday morning. I was replacing a sprinkler head in my front yard, a perfectly legitimate homeowner activity. Henderson pulled up in his golf cart, the amber lights giving a pathetic little flash. "Morning," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Mr. Johnson," he began, his voice laden with that special brand of Hendersonian gravity. "I've received a report of unauthorized landscaping modifications." I looked down at the sprinkler head in my hand, then back at him. "I'm replacing a broken sprinkler head, Henderson. It's called maintenance. All modifications require prior written approval from the Architectural Review Committee," he intoned, tapping a clipboard that looked suspiciously blank. "Replacing a broken part with an identical part isn't a modification, Arthur," I said, my patience starting to thin. "And you know my name isn't Johnson. It's Mark." He flushed slightly. He always seemed to get my name wrong, a petty power play I usually ignored. "I'll need to inspect the new sprinkler head to ensure it complies with community standards." He made to step onto my lawn. "No, you won't," I said, my voice calm but firm. I took a step forward, not aggressively, but enough to occupy the space he was about to enter. "You're not coming onto my property without an appointment and a valid reason, neither of which you have. If you have an issue, put it in writing and send it to me through the proper HOA channels." For a moment, he just stared, his mouth working silently. It was probably the first time anyone had so directly and calmly refused him. His face went from its usual pink to a rather alarming shade of puce. You can't obstruct an official HOA inspection. I have authority here." "Show me the bylaw that gives you, personally, the authority to conduct on-the-spot, unannounced inspections of routine maintenance inside my property line," I countered. "I've read the documents, Henderson, it's not in there." He sputtered, clearly unprepared for actual knowledge of the rules he purported to enforce. "You'll be hearing about this. This insubordination will be noted." He practically spat the words, then gunned his golf cart's electric motor, if such a thing can be gunned, and sped off in a silent huff. After that exchange, Henderson's attentions became more focused, more personal. The drive-bys past my house increased in frequency. I'd receive violation notices for increasingly ludicrous infractions: a single dandelion in my flower bed, which, for the record, was a bee-friendly clover patch, not a flower bed; my garden hose being improperly coiled, it was on a reel; or my newspaper being retrieved from the driveway later than the community standard of 9:00 a.m. I worked late sometimes. Each notice was duly photographed, logged, and responded to with polite, factual rebuttals, citing the relevant, or usually non-existent, HOA rules. I was building my own file, and it was becoming quite thick. I also started noticing small, almost imperceptible things: a scuff mark near my back gate, as if someone had tried to peek over. The outdoor faucet handle turned slightly differently than I'd left it. Nothing concrete, nothing I could prove was Henderson, but my senses were on alert. It felt like he was testing, probing for weaknesses, trying to find a way to get under my skin or, worse, onto my property. My neighbors, Dave in particular, noticed the increased scrutiny. "He's really got it in for you, Mark," Dave said one afternoon, leaning over the fence. "Ever since you stood up to him about that sprinkler, he's not used to that. Most people just roll over." "I don't roll over, Dave," I said, perhaps a bit more grimly than I intended. "Good," he grinned. "Some of us are quietly rooting for you." It was a small comfort, but a comfort nonetheless. I wasn't entirely alone in this escalating absurdity. The master key comment still bothered me. What if his bluster wasn't entirely bluster? What if the HOA board, in its infinite wisdom, had actually given this clown some level of access? I doubled down on my own vigilance. I started varying my routine slightly, ensuring I was home at unpredictable times. The cameras were always recording, their little green status lights a silent, watchful presence. I was a frog being slowly boiled, and Henderson was gleefully turning up the heat, oblivious to the fact that this particular frog had a rather unusual background in dealing with predators. The breaking point, I sensed, was approaching, and I would be ready for it. The day it all came to a head started like any other Tuesday. I'd been for an early run, come back, showered, and was in my kitchen making coffee, enjoying the morning sun streaming through the window. That's when I saw it: Henderson's ridiculous golf cart pulling up to my curb with an uncharacteristic urgency. He wasn't alone this time. A nervous-looking younger man in a generic HOA staff polo shirt was with him, fidgeting and avoiding eye contact with my house. This felt different. More official, in Henderson's mind at least. My internal threat assessment level ticked up a notch. I watched from the window as Henderson strode purposefully up my walkway, the staffer trailing him like a reluctant accomplice. Henderson rapped sharply on my front door. Not a polite knock, but an insistent, demanding summons. I took a deep breath, mentally ran through my protocols: observe, orient, decide, act, and opened the door, stepping out onto the porch to meet them, ensuring the door closed firmly behind me. My security cameras, I knew, had a perfect view of the entire porch and front yard. "Henderson," I greeted him, my voice even. "To what do I owe the pleasure this fine morning?" "Mr. Weber," he began, actually getting my name right for once, which was unsettling in itself. We've had an anonymous emergency call. A report of a significant water leak originating from your property. We need to enter and inspect immediately to prevent damage to community assets. He said it with an air of grave importance, but his eyes had a shifty, almost gleeful look to them. The staffer behind him looked like he wanted the earth to swallow him whole. A water leak? I replied, feigning surprise. That's odd. I haven't noticed any issues. All my systems are fine. I glanced pointedly at my water meter near the curb, which was, of course, perfectly still. The report was specific. Henderson pressed, his voice rising slightly. We can't take chances. We need access. Now, I appreciate your concern, Henderson, I said, keeping my tone reasonable. But I can assure you, there's no leak. If you'd like to wait, I can call a plumber to come and verify, and you can speak with them. But I'm not comfortable with an unannounced entry based on an anonymous report, especially given our previous interactions. This was his moment. I could see it in his eyes. He thought he had me. The emergency was his golden ticket. This isn't a request, Weber. He snapped, his face reddening. This is an official HOA action. We have the right to enter in an emergency. He gestured to the nervous staffer. Open it, he commanded. The staffer fumbled in his pocket and produced a key ring. Not a single key, but a jangling collection. My God, I thought, the master key isn't a single key. It's probably a badly managed set of copied resident keys, or worse, builder keys they never should have retained. This was a security nightmare far beyond just Henderson's ego. The staffer approached my door hesitantly, selecting a key. Henderson watched, a smug, triumphant look spreading across his face. This was his power play, his ultimate validation. He was going to force his way in, prove his dominance. The staffer inserted a key into my high-security Medico lock. Of course, it didn't turn. He tried another, and another. Each attempt was met with the solid, unyielding resistance of a superior lock. Henderson's smugness began to curdle into frustration. What's wrong? Use the right key, he barked at the increasingly flustered staffer. I am Mr. Henderson. The young man stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. None of them are working. Henderson pushed him aside impatiently. Useless. Give them to me. He snatched the keys and began trying them himself, jamming them into the lock with increasing force, muttering under his breath. The sight of this puffed-up little tyrant, utterly defeated by a piece of well-engineered metal, was almost comical. Almost. His frustration quickly boiled over into rage. His face was now a deep, alarming crimson. This is obstruction, he yelled, his voice cracking. You're deliberately interfering. I know you're hiding something. And then, the unthinkable happened. Henderson, in his fury, reached to his hip, fumbled for a moment with the flap of a holster I hadn't paid enough attention to amidst his other ridiculous accoutrements, and pulled out a handgun. It wasn't a toy. It looked like a compact semi-automatic, and he leveled it unsteadily in my direction. You will open this door, he screamed, spittle flying from his lips. I have the authority. The world seemed to slow down. My SEAL training, dormant for years in this quiet suburban life, surged to the forefront. Threat assessment. Adult male, visibly agitated, armed with a firearm, unstable grip, poor muzzle discipline, clear intent to intimidate, potentially to harm. Distance, approximately 6 feet. Environment. My front porch, clear escape routes to my flanks, but my priority was neutralizing the immediate threat. My outward demeanor remained calm. Inside, I was a coiled spring. Mr. Henderson, I said, my voice low and steady, a tone I'd used many times before in situations far more dangerous than this. Put the weapon down. Now, you are committing a felony. He just stared, eyes wide and crazed, the gun wavering. Don't tell me what to do, I'm in charge here. That was his mistake. He was too focused on his perceived authority, too lost in his own little psychodrama. He wasn't a trained operator, he was an idiot with a gun. As he shouted, his grip shifted slightly, his attention momentarily fractured. It was all the opening I needed. In less time than it takes to describe, I moved. It wasn't a flashy Hollywood maneuver. It was fast, efficient, and brutal. I closed the distance, one hand deflecting the weapon's muzzle safely away, the other striking a precise blow to his wrist and forearm. The gun clattered to the porch. Simultaneously, I used his forward momentum against him, a quick leg sweep taking him off balance. He went down hard, the air whooshing out of him with a surprised grunt. I followed him down, one knee pinning his arm, the other securing his torso. The nervous staffer just stood there, jaw agape, eyes like saucers. I retrieved the firearm, cleared it, chamber empty, magazine full, safety off, the fool, and placed it well out of reach. Then, I pulled out my phone. My voice was calm as I dialed 911. Yes, I need police assistance at 124 Willow Creek Drive, Ive. I've detained an individual, Arthur Henderson, who trespassed on my property and assaulted me with a deadly weapon. The weapon is secured. He is restrained but unharmed. Please send officers immediately. Henderson, pinned beneath me, was no longer the raging tyrant. He was a gasping, bewildered mess, the fight completely gone out of him. The only sound for a moment was his ragged breathing and the distant wail of approaching sirens. The quiet neighborhood wasn't so quiet anymore, and Mr. Henderson's reign as the king of Willow Creek Estates had just come to a very abrupt, very public end. The arrival of the local police was swift, their sirens cutting through the morning calm of Willow Creek like a hot knife through butter. 2 squad cars pulled up, lights flashing, and officers emerged, their expressions serious and professional as they took in the scene. Me, kneeling calmly beside a prone and groaning Arthur Henderson, a handgun sitting innocuously on the porch, railing a safe distance away, and a pale, trembling HOA staffer who looked like he was about to faint. I identified myself immediately, explained the situation concisely, and gestured to the cameras. Everything that just happened, from him arriving to him drawing that weapon, is recorded, I stated. One officer began attending to Henderson, checking him for injuries, mostly to his pride it seemed, and then cuffing him, while the other took my statement. Henderson, now reduced from tin pot dictator to a blubbering suspect in handcuffs, started wailing about his authority, his rights, how I had assaulted him. The officer listening to this tirade maintained an impressively stoical expression. The younger staffer, whose name I learned was Kevin, corroborated my account, his voice shaky but clear. He'd clearly been terrified by Henderson's actions and seemed relieved it was over. He also confirmed Henderson's desperate attempts to use the supposed master keys, which the police collected as evidence along with the firearm. Those keys, Kevin volunteered, Mr. Henderson got them from a locksmith buddy of his. He said they were for emergency access only, but he always carried them. That little tidbit would prove interesting later. Henderson was formally arrested for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, brandishing a firearm, and trespassing. As he was led to the squad car, still protesting his innocence and importance, I saw several of my neighbors peering out from behind their curtains, their expressions a mixture of shock and, in some cases, what looked suspiciously like satisfaction. Dave from next door gave me a discreet thumbs up from his window. Once the scene was cleared and the police had departed with a bewildered Henderson in tow, the adrenaline began to wear off, replaced by a cold, simmering anger. This man, driven by nothing more than a fragile ego and a thirst for petty power, had brought a gun to a disagreement about a non-existent water leak. He had threatened my life on my own property. The fact that I was equipped to handle it didn't lessen the severity of his actions. I immediately called my lawyer, a sharp woman named Sarah Evans, who had helped me with the closing on my house. I explained the situation. Her reaction was a mixture of professional outrage and a hint of disbelief. He pulled a gun? An HOA guy? Because his keys didn't work? She quickly shifted into action mode. Okay, Mark, I'm glad you're safe. You pressed charges, that's good. We need to follow up with the DA's office. And then there's the HOA itself. They have significant liability here. The HOA board predictably went into full damage control mode. The board president, a woman named Carol Albright, who always looked like she was smelling something vaguely unpleasant, called me later that day. Her tone was initially placatory, full of deep regrets and unfortunate misunderstandings. Mark, we are so terribly sorry about this incident with Arthur, she began, her voice oozing insincere concern. He was under a lot of stress, with his responsibilities. Carol, I interrupted, my voice devoid of warmth. Your volunteer security chief trespassed, attempted to force entry into my home, and then drew a firearm on me when he failed. Stress doesn't cover that. Gross negligence and endangerment by the HOA for allowing this man to operate with unchecked authority and, apparently, a handgun is more like it. I have the entire incident on high-definition video, by the way. Would you like a copy? There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. The mention of video evidence clearly changed the calculus. Video? She repeated, her voice suddenly much smaller. Yes, Carol. Crystal clear. I made arrangements to send her legal counsel a copy. The misunderstanding narrative died a swift death after that. News of the incident spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. My phone started ringing with calls from other residents. Some were shocked, others outraged. Several shared their own stories of Henderson's bullying and intimidation, minor in comparison to what I'd experienced, but part of a clear pattern. It turned out Mrs. Gable wasn't the only one he'd frightened. An informal neighborhood meeting was quickly organized, not by the HOA board, but by concerned residents, held in Dave's spacious backyard. The turnout was impressive. People were angry, and rightly so. They wanted answers. How had this been allowed to happen? What was the HOA going to do about it? My lawyer, Sarah, advised me to let the criminal case against Henderson run its course before taking direct civil action against the HOA, but she immediately put them on notice. We held them responsible for Henderson's actions and the environment of fear he had cultivated. She also started digging into the master key situation, which she found particularly egregious. If the HOA had sanctioned or even tacitly allowed Henderson to possess keys to residents' homes without proper controls or consent, their liability would be immense. The police investigation confirmed that the gun Henderson had brandished was legally registered to him. However, his concealed carry permit had apparently lapsed 6 months prior, adding another potential charge to his growing list of problems. He was eventually released on bail, with strict conditions that included staying away from me and Willow Creek estates. His reign of terror was officially over, but the fallout was just beginning. I found myself in the unexpected position of being a reluctant catalyst for change. My neighbors, previously cowed or apathetic, were now galvanized. They saw that Henderson wasn't an unstoppable force, just a bully who had finally picked on the wrong person. The fight wasn't just mine anymore, it was for the peace and safety of the entire community. And as I reviewed the crystal-clear footage from my security cameras, Henderson's escalating rage, the glint of the gun, his utter surprise as his world came crashing down, I knew we had the evidence to ensure he, and the system that enabled him, would be held fully accountable. This wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about restoring sanity and safety to our neighborhood. The wheels of justice, as they say, grind slowly, but in Henderson's case, they ground exceedingly fine, especially with the kind of video evidence we had. His court appearances became a sort of local spectacle, at least for those of us in Willow Creek who had suffered under his petty tyranny. He hired a blustery lawyer who tried to paint him as a dedicated community servant who had simply overreacted under pressure, a victim of a misunderstanding by an overly aggressive homeowner. That narrative fell apart spectacularly when my lawyer, Sarah, presented the security footage in court. The courtroom was silent as the video played on the large screens. Henderson's escalating demands, his fumbling with the keys, his face contorting in rage, and then the unmistakable action of him drawing the firearm and leveling it at me. There was no misunderstanding that. It was clear, unequivocal, and damning. I testified, calmly recounting the events, focusing on the facts. I described Henderson's prior pattern of harassment, the anonymous emergency call, his attempt to force entry, and the moment he threatened my life. Under cross-examination, Henderson's lawyer tried to provoke me, to paint me as some sort of vigilante. It didn't work. My training included handling intense interrogations, and this guy was strictly amateur hour. I remained calm, factual, and unwavering. The most telling moment came when the prosecutor questioned Henderson himself. On the stand, stripped of his uniform and his golf cart, Henderson was a diminished figure. He tried to stick to his story of a stressful situation and a misinterpreted action, but under oath, his bluster crumbled. He admitted the gun was his, admitted he drew it, but claimed he never intended to harm anyone, only to ensure compliance. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with years on the bench, looked thoroughly unimpressed. In the end, the jury didn't take long. Henderson was found guilty of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon and felony menacing. The brandishing charge was rolled into the assault. Given his lack of prior felony convictions, he avoided a long prison sentence, but he didn't walk away unscathed. He received 5 years of probation, a hefty fine, mandatory anger management counseling, a permanent restraining order preventing him from coming anywhere near me or my property, and, crucially, he was prohibited from ever owning firearms again. His days of playing cop were well and truly over. His wife, Mrs. Henderson, who had sat silently through the trial looking increasingly wretched, actually approached me outside the courtroom afterwards. "Mr. Weber," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "I am so sorry for what Arthur did. There's no excuse." I just nodded. There wasn't much else to say to her. She was a victim in her own way, shackled to that man's ego for years. The conviction sent shockwaves through the HOA. The board, which had been trying to downplay the incident and protect its own reputation, could no longer ignore the severity of the situation or their own culpability. Carol Albright, the board president, offered a public apology at an emergency HOA meeting, a meeting packed with angry residents. It was too little, too late for many. My lawyer, Sarah, had already initiated discussions with the HOA's legal counsel regarding a settlement for the negligence and endangerment. Faced with the irrefutable video evidence, Henderson's conviction, and the prospect of a very public and costly lawsuit, the HOA's insurance company was eager to settle. We negotiated a significant financial settlement, which, frankly, I wasn't particularly interested in for myself. Instead, I worked with Sarah to structure it so that a substantial portion went into a fund to upgrade community security, proper, vetted security measures, not a wannabe Rambo on a golf cart, and to cover legal fees for revising the HOA's outdated and dangerously vague bylaws. The remaining board members, those who had enabled Henderson or looked the other way, found their positions untenable. One by one, they resigned. A special election was called, and a new board was voted in, comprised of residents, including Dave from next door, who were genuinely committed to transparency and common sense. One of their first actions was to completely overhaul the HOA's security policies. The Neighborhood Watch and Safety Committee was disbanded. Any future security personnel would be from a licensed, bonded, and thoroughly vetted professional security firm with clearly defined roles and strict limitations on their authority. The ridiculous notion of master keys for volunteer committee heads was permanently binned. New rules were implemented regarding resident privacy, emergency access protocols, requiring actual verification of emergencies, and a clear, fair process for addressing legitimate bylaw violations. Without the harassment and intimidation that Henderson had embodied, it was a sea change. The atmosphere in Willow Creek began to shift. The fear and resentment Henderson had sown started to dissipate, replaced by a renewed sense of community and empowerment. People started talking to each other more, organizing neighborhood events, taking collective ownership of their community in a way they hadn't before. It was as if a dark cloud had lifted. The changes weren't just on paper. The new board, with Dave playing a key role, actively sought input from residents. They held open forums, sent out surveys, and made a genuine effort to govern by consensus rather than decree. The ridiculous fines for dandelions and improperly coiled hoses vanished. The focus shifted from punitive enforcement of trivialities to genuinely maintaining the quality of life and shared amenities. My life returned to the quiet I had originally sought, albeit with a slightly higher neighborhood profile than I'd intended. People would nod, smile, sometimes stop to thank me. I wasn't looking for accolades. The peace of mind and the restored sanity of the neighborhood were reward enough. The irony was not lost on me. I'd come to Willow Creek to escape conflict, only to find myself in the middle of a suburban psychodrama. But the skills I'd hoped to leave behind had, in a strange way, helped bring about a positive resolution, not just for me, but for everyone. It was a stark reminder that sometimes standing your ground calmly and methodically is the only way to deal with a bully, whether they're on a battlefield or a bedecked golf cart. The tale of Arthur Henderson became a local legend, a cautionary tale about unchecked ego and the abuse of petty power. His ridiculously accessorized golf cart was eventually sold off at an HOA auction. I heard it went for a surprisingly low price, and the proceeds were donated to a local youth charity. A fitting end, I thought, to his little reign. So, that's how a quiet retirement turned into a suburban showdown. It just goes to show, you never know what skills might come in handy, or what kind of crazy you'll run into next, even in the most seemingly placid of environments. Thanks for watching, and remember to check your HOA bylaws, and maybe, just maybe, your security chief's credentials and mental stability. You never really know who you're dealing with until things get interesting. Drop another comment if you've had your own HOA horror story. I'm starting to think they're more common than we realize. Stay safe out there.